everything has to be right for people to feel comfortable. And that's sort of one of the things that I think that a lot of, brew pubs, but restaurants just get wrong. One of the things I find really interesting with graphic designers is that you go to them because you don't know how to do any of that. And they're like, right, tell us what you want. It's like, well, that's your job.
G'day and welcome to Good Gravy, brought to you by Busboy, a show where we sit down with hospitality experts and extract actionable advice you can apply to your venue. My name is Taylor and I'm your host. Today we're joined by Andrew Turner. He's the owner of two venues, The Chapel, a cafe inside a converted church, and also Communion Brewing, a family-focused brew pub. Both venues are located in Burnie on the northwest coast of Tasmania, Australia. Now, when I first discovered Communion, I was very impressed by the quality of their branding, from the beer cans to the fit out. Now, for what is a brewery in a small town, they had taken a very professional approach. I see a lot of venues, even some larger than Communion, show very little consideration towards their branding. Now, I know branding and agencies can be a little intimidating to some venue owners, so I wanted to ask Andrew what that experience was like. In this episode, we cover why Andrew decided to invest in professional branding, why he decided to do a brand refresh after just 2 years, the thought process behind his minimalist design, and then also why he decided to finally get into distribution. If you have any questions or feedback about this episode, simply send me an email at hello@goodgravy.show, and also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Let's get started. G'day, Andrew, and welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're in Communion Brewing today.
Yeah.
This is your second venue. I want to dive today into your branding you've got around the place. Before we do, just give me the quick elevator pitch about Communion.
Okay, so we opened about 18 months ago, and the idea with Communion obviously is that it's a space for everyone. Our tagline, as you can see over there, is not for us alone. And so, as with the chapel, it's all about the community that's built around the venue. Obviously, it's a restaurant, but it has a 500-litre brewery attached to it. So you've got 6,000-litre tanks there where we produce all the beer on site. But I guess the thing that makes this different to just a normal restaurant or even a little brewery is that we really try and build up the community in this venue and also obviously around town. Burnie's not that big, hasn't had anything like this before. And so, the community that we built around the chapel over the last 8 years is amazing. Like, the people that call that place home is something that we're really proud of. So that's quite a small space and obviously is mainly for daytime. So I just needed somewhere to go for a beer after that.
The local element really shines through your branding, and that's what I'd like to dive in deeper today. Your logo you've got the Communion, then you've also got an illustration of the facade of the building.
Mm-hmm.
And this carries across, the same style of illustration carries across all your beer cans. It's quite consistent, as well as the website, the menu. And then even inside, you've got quite a large mural featuring different elements that reference the city that you're in, being Burnie. When did you decide you wanted to invest in professional branding?
Oh, that was never a question. Honestly, like, for me, that's as important as anything. So having a comfortable space is everything, and that includes how it looks and feels. So the company that did all of our branding is based in New Zealand, just happens to have a bit of a family link, and we knew that they did hospitality design in particular. So they actually designed the whole venue as well as all of the imagery, and they have artists that they employ for all of that. But that was just a part of the fact that the whole place needed to be right. So that's the comfortable seats, the lighting that's right, the sound is right. Everything has to be right for people to feel comfortable. And that's sort of one of the things that I think that a lot of, brew pubs, but restaurants just get wrong. When you go and sit in there and the lights are all the way up and the music's too quiet and you're sitting there feeling like you're in the middle of nowhere. It was very important that we got all of those things right. And the branding was just part of that. So it was never a question, but yeah, it did cost a fair bit.
And was that a new experience for you? I know you've got
Totally.
Another venue which we can touch on later on, which opened about 5 or 6 years before Communion.
Mm-hmm.
What preconception did you have of the branding experience? Were you going in fresh?
Yeah, pretty much. So we branded that properly, as in, again, a bit of a family link. My sister is a graphic designer and she helped us come up with a proper logo and designed a font for us, and we've been using that since, and just variations on that. So we didn't have a whole brand package or anything like that. So this was a whole new thing. So having a full brand pitch and the venue design was a fair bit and involved, obviously all of the steps. One of the things I find really interesting with graphic designers is that you go to them because you don't know how to do any of that, and you don't, you need sort of input and ideas, and they're like, right, tell us what you want. That's your job. It was a bit of an interesting process, sort of, that back and forward of going, what's the vibe? And it's really more about them knowing what questions to ask us. And so they really kind of delved into a little bit of the history of Burnie. And obviously one of the things with communion, in particular the word, and having religious associations, not that it's all about religion. Like if you look it up in the dictionary, it's shared participation in something good. That's the actual definition of it. You could go down a rabbit hole with that, and you could have, the blood of Christ lager or whatever. We didn't want to do any of that. We didn't want to play on it. We wanted to go through what the proper meaning of it was, and not necessarily what it's become in that church circle. So there was a fair bit they kind of had to delve through with all of that. And obviously the history of Burnie we touched on a little bit, but not too much. They actually uncovered that not for us alone. So the Burnie motto, which is actually on the City Council seal, is not for ourselves alone. I think it's non nobis solum or something like that. They found that and were like, do you realise that your kind of vibe lines up exactly with your city's motto? And we just tweaked a little bit, and that's our tagline. So it was great.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to bring that up. Did you have to pass that with the council at all, or were you just free to do that?
Nah. Well, it's a common Latin phrase, so it's not trademarked. We just ripped it off.
And did you have the name before you approached the agency?
Yeah, we did. That was an interesting one. So I knew the vibe that we were going for, obviously, that sort of that bringing people together in a comfortable space. It is an interesting story. It was up in Queensland or something, and I just woke up in the middle of the night and was like, you know what this place is going to be called? It's going to be called Communion. And I actually wrote it down on my phone. And then when I woke up in the morning, I was like, I can't do that. There's too much attached to it. It's a very religious word. I'm going to piss off all of the church people in town. I'm going to alienate half of the other people in town that don't want to have anything to do with church. I like the idea, but I can't use that word. So I was like, right, we just need to find a word that's like communion, but it's not communion. And then we were out that night at a friend's place, and I was sort of talking about the fact that we were going to be doing this sort of thing. And he's like, have you thought of a name? And I was like, oh, not really. I'm still working on it. I don't really know what I'm going to do. And he said to me, you know what you should call it? You should call it Communion. I'm like, what? I hadn't told anyone that at all. And so I was like, right, okay, well, maybe I should have a bit more of a think about this, because that's wild. Yeah, and then just ran it past a few people, and we're like, you know what, it is... I think the church has sort of ruined it a little bit, that word, obviously depending on your views, but they've kind of turned this beautiful thing. And like even if you look at what it is, that shared meal, like the bread and the wine sort of thing, that is actually a meal, not little bits of bread and wine, and it's meant to be around a shared table. That concept is good. And then it's kind of just been watered down into this thing that people do once a week that has still a lot of meaning, but I think has been changed from what it should have been. And I think this is sort of a bit closer to what it was. People actually kind of getting together and sharing life and sharing meaningful moments. That's what I think it's more about.
I mean, when I first came across the brand, I didn't have those connotations, at least in my mind. And I think you've separated that well enough for it to not really be an issue. Did the agency you worked with, did they pitch you any other names, or were they happy to run with that?
No. I was pretty sold on it by that point. I was like, this is what it's called. You do sort of garner feedback from people as you kind of talk, the brewery supply guys, like when I talk to them about, when I was ordering all the tanks, it's like, oh, what's the name called? And I'm like, Communion. And he's like, that's actually a really good name. That is, I love it, And so you kind of get little bits of feedback along the way.
The illustrations you've got your hero illustration, which is the facade of the building, but then you've got others that carry across to the cans. Did you work with the agency in terms of branding the names of your beers and then deciding what those logos will be?
Yeah, so that was a bit of a team effort. I think we probably came up with most of the names, and then we kind of workshopped the graphics that went alongside them. We've actually just done a bit of I don't know if you've seen our new cans that have only just come out in the last couple of weeks. We've done a bit of a not a brand refresh, just a little bit of a tweak on all of those and got moved to printed cans away from labels. So super happy with those. We're kind of moving slightly away from the cartoony aspect, which obviously all of the mural on the wall behind you there is pretty locked in. So it's a bit of an awkward one, but moving a little bit more of the sketchy design. So yeah, the names, they all kind of have meaning for us. A lot of the beer names are trying to be funny, lager than life, that's our latest brew or whatever. Ours kind of touch on local elements and also touch on what the beer is. So for example, the Troublemaker has your kookaburras. So kookaburras are known to be a little bit troublemakery. They're actually pretty wild birds. They look very cute, and then they'll pluck a baby bird from a nest and just chomp on it whole, right? They're quite interesting creatures. And so the Troublemaker is named after it being a 6% very easy drinking IPA. So that's an example of that. The Coastie, which is one of our new beers. Obviously, Coastie is another name for a surf lifesaver. We've got one of Australia's oldest clubs on our beachfront CBD, and that's got a picture of the surf lifesaving boat drawn on that as well. So they all kind of link in. Papermaker, obviously, this is where Reflex was made in Burnie for many, many years.
And you've got one called Normal Beer as well.
Yep.
Why'd you call it that?
Well, so up at the chapel, that's where I've started brewing. So we used to run Friday nights up there, and that's how I started. We make everything from scratch. We roast our own coffee. We bake all the cakes, as much food as we can. We make from scratch up there, and it basically got to the point where I was a little bit bored with just doing coffee all day long and thought, well, beer can't be that hard. Set up a proper brewery. It's a small one in my shed, and started making beers to serve on the Friday nights. One of the interesting things was that when people came to our Friday nights, they were coming for our event with our musos and the products that we serve. But when we had birthday parties or functions, people would come along that wouldn't normally come to the chapel. And the question that I got asked a lot, because we only served Tasmanian craft beer, was, do you have any normal beer? And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to brew a normal beer, and brewed a pretty easy drinking ale with light malt, light hops, similar to your draft style, and called it normal beer so that I could actually say, yes, we do have normal beer.
I think it's good branding as well, because there's that group of breweries and venues that perhaps try and make things fancier than what they are.
Yeah.
And for regular drinkers, particularly in the northwest coast of Tassie,
Yep.
they just want something simple.
Yep.
And so when you've got something there that's just normal beer,
Yeah.
it makes the decision easy,
Oh,
simple.
absolutely.
It's a talking point as well.
Yeah. I still got asked for it. As in, people come up to the bar and say, do you just have any normal beer? And not knowing that we have a beer called normal beer, and I'm able to have a little giggle and say, yep, here you go.
Right. And for those people, that becomes a memorable experience
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Especially, they didn't know the name of it. They made that request. And then you can just say, hey, look, we do have normal beer.
Yeah.
Point them to the label. And I imagine, you get quite a few laughs out of that.
Yeah, and that one has the toll ship on the label. And for Burnie people, the toll ship coming and going each day is normal. It comes in the morning and leaves over the afternoon. But you can basically kind of set your clocks by it. So for us, that was a very normal Burnie thing. That's just why it's on the label.
Did you make that decision to put the boat on there?
Yeah.
And what spurred the recent rebrand of your cans? They're quite, for the listener at home, they're more minimalist.
Even more minimalist. They were already fairly minimalist. Our cans on the shelf stood out because they were basically white.
I think a lot of breweries, and you mentioned this about before we recorded, about breweries going perhaps a little too crazy.
Yeah.
And you end up with cans that are just a smorgasbord of colours.
Oh, absolutely. Screaming off the shelf.
Yeah. And, maybe there was a day when those ones stood out, but if you've got something that's simple that's on the shelf, that's going to stand out amongst
It's the trend.
the tirade of colours.
Yeah.
And maybe, do you save on printing costs as well?
I think it's probably slightly cheaper because we're doing such small runs of labels that there was quite expensive way to do it. It's definitely a better look. I prefer the way that they look now. I think it's more premium, and you're able to print over the whole can. Yeah, I think the finish is better, and it's also faster. So when we're canning, you don't have to use a labeler, and so you can run the canning line a bit faster.
And it's faster because of the different process.
Yeah, so you're taking a whole step out of the process. So one of the slowest part of canning beer is actually putting the label on the can.
Yeah, for the listener at home, it's generally two colours, the new cans.
Yeah. Yep.
You've got your illustration at the top, name at the bottom. Why did you decide to go through a rebrand? Considering you're only 2 years old?
I know, and it cost a fair bit too. I don't know. It wasn't necessary. No, I guess we were wanting to move to printed cans, and if once you do that, you're going to have to replace that label. And so I chatted to the design guys. Was like, how about we just give it a little bit of a tweak? I feel as though this style, our kind of previous style, was just a bit on the fun side, which was good because we needed to present as a family venue. So we're not a grungy brewery here. It's not bearded guys coming and smashing beers all afternoon. It's you come here and it's just there's a heap of families. It's a very soft space, and so that helped make that kind of slightly more cartoon. But I felt like we'd grown up a little bit from that, and I felt like it didn't kind of really represent what we wanted. And it's the same illustrations, but sort of it looks a little bit, they sort of described it more like a tattoo as opposed to a cartoon, and so it's a little bit more drawn. Same artist even, and we've just tweaked them a little bit so the ship, is slightly less cartoony, and we've also shifted the hierarchy on the label. So the Communion used to be bigger because no one knew what we were, and it used to be Communion and it used to be Troublemaker. That was the branding, and now it's actually swapped so that because people are used to what we look like a little bit, it's actually now Easy IPA is the biggest thing on the can, so that when you're shopping and you're looking over all the other things, you're like, IPA, that's what I'm looking for, and then you get the secondary items from that. So we've changed the hierarchy of how it looks on the can.
In an earlier recording I found of yours, you said you weren't going into distribution. Has that changed?
A little bit. We're not focusing on it, but it is a good way to get the brand out there and also to have a slightly higher beer turnover. It's a big venue, but because it's more restaurant focused than Brewpub, we go through a lot of beer, but not that much beer. And so to keep the batches turning over quickly, it's important to get that beer moving out, get it drunk so we can brew the next batch again. And it might be 6 months between batches if we just serve it all here, whereas we can get it down to 1 or 2 months by distributing it. And obviously getting our brand out there means that you have a Communion beer in Hobart, then you're like, oh, next time in Burnie, I'll have to go there. So it does work. We were getting asked for it, and obviously sending beer to Hobart via normal kind of distribution channels is just tricky and gets to be a bit of a pain in the butt.
Yeah, particularly from a branding standpoint, you're essentially having mini billboards and fridges around the state. And I assume it's just Tasmania at this stage that you're distributing to.
We don't go anywhere else. And that's sort of probably definitely where I draw that line. The Bass Strait is a nightmare. Shipping costs are wild. Like even just beer down to Hobart is really expensive. Across the refrigerated transport, because all our beer travels cold, which is one of the other differences that we insist on. So even from here down to Hobart, cold storage in Hobart keeps it fresh. We've sent one keg over to Melbourne for Pint of Origin. So actually there was 2. So the Lincoln has a Pint of Origin over there. That's the first time our beer was poured interstate, and that'll be the sort of thing, as long as, because that was a mixed pallet, so it went down to Hobart, they got consolidated and sent up. So technically I didn't distribute to Melbourne, but we're not really interested in interstate at all. Beer is best drunk in the shadow of the brewery. So come to Burnie, folks.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Andrew. Where can people learn more about Communion?
Follow us on socials is probably the best thing. So Instagram or Facebook, Communion Brewing Co. Jump on our website if you want to buy some beers now that I've got that working again.
And do you ship nationwide?
Yeah, it's pretty good. We have access to really cheap shipping rates. So down to Hobart's $9 a carton. It's pretty cheap. Even up to Queensland it's only about 20. So that's not too bad for shipping a ridiculously heavy large thing around the country. So,
and are you finding many direct-to-consumer sales?
Nah, no, not really. It's definitely not a big thing for us. I'm sure that if we pushed it harder, we could do it. But to be honest, it's not our core business. Our core business is where we're sitting right now. People in here enjoying beer in the shadow of the brewery.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Gravy. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to shoot me an email at hello@goodgravy.show, and make sure to subscribe in your favourite podcast app.